family of 4 vanished without a trace during what was supposed to be a routine hiking getaway in the rugged heart of Glacier National Park, Montana. Initially dismissed as yet another heartbreaking wilderness mishap, their disappearance would soon unravel into something far more disturbing. 3 weeks after their absence, a remote wildlife camera captured an image, fleeting, eerie, impossible to explain, that reignited questions and unearthed a darkness no one had dared to imagine. The wind keened across the mountain ridges like a distant, mournful song, ushering in the chill of another frigid front. Glacier's wild expanse was painted in hues of gray and white, with swirling mist obscuring much of the alpine landscape. From the last gondola of the morning, a solitary figure stepped out onto the frostbitten platform. Her hiking boots, scarred from decades of use, crunched against the snow-blanketed trail. Eleanor Whitaker, Ellie, to those who knew her, paused for a moment, lifting her gaze toward the shadowy path ahead. She was 67, her posture upright and steady, her movement deliberate yet strong, carrying the composure of someone whose bones had long adapted to the altitude. Her lined face betrayed little emotion, save for the sharp focus in her pale blue eyes that had surveyed these slopes for most of her adult life. Fog drifted low, hugging the trails like a restless spirit. But Ellie didn't falter. The terrain, though treacherous to many, was second nature to her. For over 30 years, she had served as a park ranger and wilderness survival instructor, patrolling these very routes, guiding lost hikers to safety, and teaching others how to endure Glacier's unforgiving embrace. Adjusting the straps on her backpack, Ellie set off with determination, boots pressing deep into the snow as she moved along the winding trail toward the rustic lodge that marked the beginning of several hiking circuits. The lodge, a timber-built refuge, with smoke gently billowing from its stone chimney, stood resilient against the icy wind, a familiar sanctuary nestled into the slope. Pushing through the creaking wooden door, Ellie stepped into the warmth of the foyer, shedding a layer of chill as she stamped snow from her soles. Behind the front desk, a familiar figure looked up and brightened immediately. "Ms. Whitaker?" the young man asked, voice rising in recognition. His name tag read Tom. His breath caught slightly at the sight of her. "Didn't think we'd see you back so soon." Ellie offered a tight-lipped smile, more of an acknowledgement than joy. "Hello, Tom." Her voice, low and firm, carried a heaviness that had settled over her like a cloak since the day she received the last message from her son. Tom, sensing her intent, leaned in closer, his tone softening. "Any word about your family?" She shook her head once, the motion small but weighty, the furrows around her eyes deepening. Most visitors knew her as Old Ranger Ellie, a living legend in the hiking community. Her post-retirement efforts, especially the popular women's survival retreats she ran in the summer, had only added to her already storied reputation. But now, the strength that once inspired others was the same strength holding her upright in the face of unimaginable uncertainty. "No," she said as she unzipped her parka, her breath catching slightly in the warm indoor air. "That's why I'm here." Tom nodded, his expression solemn, aware that there was little comfort he could offer someone clinging to hope like a lifeline. Everyone in the area knew the story. The Whitakers, Daniel, Ellie's only son, along with his wife Rachel and their 6-year-old twin daughters Ivy and Wren, had embarked on a casual weekend hike almost a month ago. What should have been a joyful family outing had spiraled into a tragedy with no answers. No distress calls, no evidence, just absence. Ellie reached into her pack and pulled out a freshly printed stack of missing person posters. The top image displayed the family in a moment of perfect stillness. Daniel with his sturdy frame and trademark green hoodie, Rachel always smiling, her honey brown hair swept by the breeze, and the twins, Ivy in a lemon-yellow jacket and Wren in lavender, both grinning wide with twin gaps from missing baby teeth. "I'd like to put up new ones," Ellie said quietly, offering the stack to Tom. "Replace the old ones along the lodge trails and trailheads." "Of course," Tom said, taking the posters with gentle hands. "We'll get these up right away. The manager already gave the okay. He said, whatever you need, just ask." Ellie nodded her thanks, the weight of gratitude not fully reaching her voice. The support of the locals had been constant and genuine, but their sympathy couldn't pierce the numbing fog of her worry. She moved through the lodge with methodical purpose, posting flyers on bulletin boards, nailing them near trail signs, and taping them to entrance doors. As she worked, her mind drifted unbidden to the last conversation she'd had with Daniel. That morning had started like any other, a crisp Saturday with a light snowfall brushing the treetops. He'd called, playful and excited. "Come with us, Mom," he'd said, laughter dancing in his voice. "The girls want more of those Grandma Ellie mountain legends." She'd been tempted. She'd nearly canceled her other engagement, a charity event benefiting wilderness education programs for at-risk youth. But it had been planned months in advance and was too important to abandon. So she'd made a promise. "Next time," she'd said, "take lots of pictures for me." And they had. Around midday, as she was arranging displays for the event, her phone had pinged. It was a photo message from Daniel, a perfect snapshot of the four of them standing against a stunning ridge, the mountains towering behind them like ancient sentinels. Ellie had smiled at the familiar setting. They always took pictures at that same spot, year after year. Rachel once mused about creating a visual timeline of the girls' growth beside the steadfast peaks. It had seemed like such a lovely, heartfelt tradition. That picture would be the last time she saw them. Later that evening, as she returned home, Ellie noticed several missed calls from Daniel. A text message had followed. It read, "Weather turning fast, cutting the hike short, talk later." She had tried calling him back instantly, but her call was sent straight to voicemail. Rachel's phone, too, rang unanswered. At first she told herself not to panic. Reception was notoriously unreliable in Glacier's higher altitudes. But as night fell and still there was no word, the worry inside her hardened into something else. Something sharp and unshakable. She called the authorities by sunrise. By noon, coordinated search teams were combing the trails. Helicopters hovered overhead, while volunteers fanned out across familiar routes. Many who joined the search remembered Daniel as a child, trailing behind his mother on safe trails, his curiosity boundless. But as days passed and no signs emerged, the optimism thinned. After 7 days, the lead coordinator, a seasoned search and rescue officer, had delivered the words Ellie dreaded most. "We've searched every probable area, Miss Whitaker. With the storms that moved through, we have to consider the likelihood that this was a tragic accident." But Ellie had refused to believe it. Daniel was no novice. He knew the signs of weather shifts better than most. He would have turned back, sought cover, done everything right. Something else had happened. Something unaccounted for. That belief, unshaken and burning in her chest, was what had brought her back. If the official search had ended, then she would continue alone, because if no one else would find her family, she would. She would carry the burden herself. No one else could pursue this search with the same unyielding devotion. As Ellie stepped back into the icy wilderness, a gust of wind bit through the layers of her jacket. Her fingers, though gloved, stiffened with the cold, making the task of pinning up each flyer a small act of perseverance. She secured them with practiced care, choosing tree trunks and trail markers that would hold firm against the unpredictable mountain wind. Each poster bore the same image: Daniel, Rachel, and the twins, smiling brightly, a snapshot frozen in time. As she fastened another to a wooden trail post, her gaze lingered on the family photo. The memory of that last message, the picture Daniel had sent, pressed sharply against her heart. None of them had known what waited ahead. None of them had sensed the danger that would soon consume their path. They looked so happy, so full of life. Her son's broad grin. Rachel's sunlit eyes. Ivy and Wren are beaming, holding hands. The innocence of the moment haunted her now. A couple of hikers passed by, bundled in parkas and wool hats, their steps crunching softly in the snow. They paused, eyes flicking from the flyer to Ellie. Recognition lit their faces, followed swiftly by something more tender: pity. Ellie met their gaze for a fleeting moment, offering no words, only a tight nod. She'd grown accustomed to those looks in recent weeks. People saw her not just as the legendary ranger, but as the mother of the missing. But Ellie didn't need pity. What she needed was answers. What would bring her family home wasn't sympathy, it was determination, and she had plenty of that left. At the main trailhead she paused once more, staring up at the mountain range looming ahead. The peaks were hidden beneath a dense canopy of clouds, veiled as if in mourning. Somewhere up there, hidden in the snow-laced wild, were the clues she sought, maybe even her family. She didn't know how or where yet, but she felt it with every breath. The truth was up there, and she would uncover it. She resumed her route, methodically working her way along the path, placing flyers at regular intervals. She stopped, passing hikers whenever she could, showing them the flyer, her voice steady but pleading. Each interaction followed the same familiar pattern: furrowed brows, shaking heads, polite but sad expressions. "Sorry, haven't seen anything," they'd say. Or, "I'll keep an eye out." After the 20th response of "no, sorry," a sense of weariness threatened to set in, but Ellie fought it off. She had come too far to let despair win now. About 2 miles up the trail, as she fastened another poster to a weathered signpost, a noise drew her attention. Footsteps, not the casual pace of hikers, but deliberate, sure-footed steps, came from her right. She turned, eyes narrowing as a man emerged from the tree line. He was in his early 50s by the look of him, wearing a camouflage jacket beneath an orange hunter's vest. He moved with confidence, a seasoned presence in the wilderness. His face, half obscured by a thick graying beard, bore the wind-worn look of someone who belonged in the woods. "Excuse me," he called out, his breath forming small clouds in the crisp air. "Mind if I take one of those?" Ellie straightened, scrutinizing him as he approached. Something about him suggested familiarity with the land, an old-school kind of outdoorsman. "Of course," she said, handing over one of the flyers. "Name's Cal Jennings," he said as he extended a gloved hand. "I hunt up here. Been doing it for 30 years. She shook his hand, grip firm. "Eleanor Whitaker. Most folks call me Ellie." Recognition sparked in his eyes. "The ranger? Heard about you plenty. Folks in town speak highly of what you've done for the park." Cal's gaze dropped to the flyer. He studied it carefully, eyes narrowing as he absorbed the details. "When did you say they disappeared?" 3 weeks ago," she replied, her voice steadier than she felt. "Almost a month now." He pulled a small device from his inner jacket pocket, some kind of field monitor with a screen. "I think I might have something. I've got trail cams all over this side of the range, for tracking deer mostly." Ellie's pulse quickened. "You think one of them might have caught something?" Cal didn't answer immediately. His gloved fingers tapped the screen, scrolling through images and video clips captured over the last few weeks. His casual manner gave way to a focused seriousness. His movements slowed, his brow furrowed. "What is it?" Ellie asked, unable to hide the urgency in her voice. "Did you see someone?" He still didn't speak. He stopped scrolling, his finger hovering just above the screen. His jaw tightened. "Miss Whitaker," he said quietly, "I think you'd better look at this." He turned the device toward her. The footage was grainy, obscured slightly by fog and low lighting, but it was clear enough. The angle suggested a hidden camera mounted on a tree, trained across a narrow section of underbrush. As the seconds ticked forward, 3 figures appeared on screen. A woman with shoulder-length hair moved cautiously, her body slightly hunched from cold or exhaustion. She wore a jacket in a light coral or faded pink. 2 small children followed closely, one in a yellow coat, the other in lavender. Ellie's breath hitched. Her heart slammed against her ribs. "That's them," she whispered. "That's Rachel and the twins." Cal gave a slow nod. "I figured. Look at the timestamp." Ellie did. Her eyes widened. 3 days ago," she whispered, nearly dropping the device. 3 days. They're alive. They're still out there." "But where's Daniel?" she added, eyes searching the edges of the screen. "My son should be with them." Cal zoomed in as best he could. "These are motion-triggered cams. They only capture what moves through that narrow field. If your son was behind them, or stepped off the trail for even a moment, he wouldn't have been recorded." Ellie stared at the paused footage, taking in every detail. Rachel's face looked pale, her mouth set in a grim line. The girls moved slowly, clinging to their mother's coat. They looked tired, cold, but alive. At one point, Rachel turned slightly toward the lens, close enough to make out her features, but clearly unaware of the hidden camera. "Where was this taken?" Ellie asked, her voice trembling with urgency. Cal tapped a button and brought up a GPS overlay. Right here, he said, pointing. North slope, about 8 miles from where we're standing. Terrain up there's rough, jagged ridges, steep gullies, unmarked trails. Ellie's eyes widened. That's beyond the area the search teams covered. The police ruled it out, said it was too hazardous. No marked trails, high avalanche risk after the last storm. Exactly, Cal confirmed. No one expected a family with young kids to end up that far out. But they did, Ellie said, a determined edge in her voice. She turned back to him, eyes blazing with renewed fire. I need a copy of that footage. I need to get this to the authorities. Immediately. I'll send it to you, Cal said, already cueing the transfer. Give me your email. She rattled it off, fingers trembling as she gripped her phone. And here, he added, scribbling something on a scrap of waterproof notepaper, my number. Call me if you need help heading up that way. I know those northern ridges better than anyone. Ellie nodded, emotion thick in her throat. Thank you. This is the first real sign we've had. You have no idea what this means to me. I hope it helps, Cal replied, placing the monitor back into his vest. I really do. He glanced at the darkening sky. I need to get moving. Got what I came for today? He motioned toward the rifle strapped to his back and the full game bag slung over one shoulder. You going to be all right? Ellie looked down at her phone, the footage still playing, and nodded. Yes, she said, voice steady. I will now. I'm heading back to my cabin to contact the authorities right away, Ellie said, her voice edged with urgency. Together, she and Cal made their way down the snowy trail toward the lodge. The descent was easier than the climb, but Ellie barely noticed the terrain beneath her boots. Her thoughts raced, tumbling over themselves in a swirl of possibilities. Her family, Rachel and the twins, were alive. As of 3 days ago, they had been moving through those mountains. That footage changed everything. The police would have to reopen the search now, recalibrate their approach, and investigate areas previously written off as too dangerous. When they reached the clearing near the lodge, Cal gave her a respectful nod and tipped his cap. Remember, call if you need anything, he said, his voice low and steady. Ellie met his eyes with a grateful smile. Thank you, Cal. I won't forget. She watched him as he turned and walked toward the distant parking lot, his silhouette growing smaller against the vast white backdrop. Then she pivoted, striding toward her rented cabin with newfound energy pulsing in her veins. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, something other than dread stirred in her chest. Hope. It was fragile, yes, but real, and it pushed her forward. Inside her cabin, Ellie kicked off her boots, shrugged out of her coat, and immediately reached for her phone. Her hands trembled slightly as she unlocked the screen and navigated to her saved contacts. She tapped the name she'd looked at 100 times in recent weeks, Detective Marshall. Detective Marshall? Came the familiar voice on the other end, calm and professional. This is Eleanor Whitaker, she said, steadying her voice with effort. I have new evidence. I believe my family is still alive. There was a pause, just long enough to feel like a heartbeat skipped, before Marshall replied, What kind of evidence, Miss Whitaker? Video footage, Ellie said, captured by a hunter's trail cam. It shows my daughter-in-law and granddaughters moving through the forest. The footage is dated 3 days ago. She quickly explained how she'd met Cal Jennings, described the location of the footage and the identifiable features of Rachel and the twins in the video. I'm sending you the file right now, she continued, pulling up the email Cal had just transferred. You need to see this. We need to restart the search immediately. Marshall listened quietly as she spoke, then responded with professional calm. I'll take a look at the footage right away. Ellie paced the tight space of the cabin, her eyes flicking toward the window as the daylight outside began to dim. It was approaching 4:00 p.m., and in the mountains that meant night was only minutes away. Shadows already stretched long across the snow-covered ground. After several moments, Marshall's voice came through again, slower this time. This does appear to be your daughter-in-law and granddaughters, he acknowledged. But Miss Whitaker, we can't initiate a full search this late in the day. What do you mean? Ellie asked sharply, unable to keep the frustration out of her voice. They're out there right now. I understand your urgency, he said, but as someone with your background, you know the risks. Nighttime search operations in mountainous terrain, especially unmarked territory, pose serious hazards. We'd be endangering more lives than we might save. Billy moved to the window, watching as park rangers helped usher the last remaining hikers down from the trails. Above the peaks, ominous clouds had begun to gather again. More snow was coming. The sky looked heavy with it. The forecast is calling for additional snowfall tonight, Marshall continued. We can't send teams into that kind of terrain with failing light and poor visibility. We'd only be putting more people at risk. As much as Ellie wanted to argue, she knew he was right. She had been on enough rescues to understand why night searches were called off, no matter the stakes. Still, it hurt, knowing her family was so close, yet unreachable. What about air support, helicopters, she asked, desperate for any alternative. Not in these conditions, Marshall said, and certainly not after dark. Visibility's already deteriorating. He paused, then added, From what I can tell in the footage, they don't appear to be in immediate danger. They're upright, mobile, and moving with purpose. That gives us some time. Ellie sank into a chair, the phone pressed tightly to her ear. Her mind screamed at her to do something, but her experience whispered that waiting until dawn was the right choice. So we wait until morning, she said quietly. First light, Marshall confirmed. I'll coordinate with the park authorities tonight and arrange a formal search at daybreak. We'll plan the safest possible approach to that area, I promise. We'll do everything in our power to find them. I want to be part of the search, Ellie said quickly. You know my credentials. You know I can handle it. I do, he said. Given your experience, I think that can be arranged. Just report to the ranger station by 6 a.m. sharp. When the call ended, Ellie sat in silence, the cabin feeling suddenly still and constrictive. She looked down at the frozen frame of the video still open on her phone. Rachel's face half turned, the twins close behind her. Alive, but alone. And Daniel, still absent. Cal had suggested Daniel might have been out of frame or taking a different route. It was possible. But Ellie knew her son. He wouldn't have separated from his family, not willingly. Especially not with Ivy and Wren. He'd been a cautious father, always alert to danger, always the protector. And why had they ventured into such a perilous area to begin with? It was nowhere near their usual trails, deep in a zone marked by unstable ground and avalanche risk. Daniel wouldn't have led them there without a compelling reason. Something had drawn them north, or forced them. More questions circled in her mind, offering no comfort, only dread. She stood and walked back to the window, watching the last streaks of light slip behind the jagged skyline. Tiny white specks drifted down, the start of the next snowfall. Just hold on, she whispered, pressing her fingers against the cold glass. Please, hold on until morning. As night fell over the peaks, the walls of the cabin seemed to close in. The once cozy space now felt too small, the silence within it too loud. Despite the flickering fire in the hearth, a chill settled into her bones, one born not from temperature, but anxiety. Her stomach growled, reminding her that she hadn't eaten since breakfast. She glanced at the clock. 6:30 p.m. With a sigh, she decided to head to the lodge's main hall for the communal dinner. Sitting alone in this silence would only fuel her spiraling thoughts. She bundled herself in her coat and stepped back into the snow. The wind had calmed, but the flakes were falling thicker now, illuminated by the golden glow of the lodge's outdoor lamps. The courtyard was empty, the trails deserted, every hiker now safe indoors. As she neared the lodge, warm light spilled from the windows, and she caught glimpses of movement inside. A group had gathered near the great stone fireplace in the center of the hall. Laughter and casual chatter drifted through the heavy glass doors, a stark contrast to the tension coiled in Ellie's chest. You are under arrest for the murder of Daniel Whitaker and the attempted murder of Eleanor Whitaker and Wren Whitaker. You have the right to remain silent. The detective's voice was calm but firm as he began reading Rachel her rights. Ellie stood in the hospital room, her fists clenched, watching the woman who had shattered her family with calculated cruelty. The heartache she'd carried since her son's disappearance now pulsed with a sharp, unforgiving clarity. Rachel didn't flinch until the detective mentioned Cal Jennings' sworn statement. Then, like a mask slipping, her face twisted in defiance. "He's lying," she spat, her voice rising in pitch. "It was Cal. He's the one who—" "Save it for your lawyer," the detective interrupted, cutting her off with practiced efficiency. "You'll have an opportunity to respond through the proper channels." Ellie stepped forward, unable to stay silent. "Why, Rachel?" she asked, her voice trembling. "Daniel was good to you. He gave you everything. Why would you do this?" Rachel turned her head on the hospital pillow, her gaze like flint. "Good?" she sneered. "Is that what you think? We were falling apart for months. He was sneaking around, meeting a woman from work. Said it was business, but I saw the way he looked at her. I saw the messages." Ellie shook her head slowly. "No. That's not Daniel. You misread the signs, Rachel. He would have never—" "He told me he wanted a divorce," Rachel hissed, eyes flashing. "He was going to rewrite our prenup, cut me out, make a trust for the twins, and he didn't even have the decency to tell me straight. Just slipped away." "So you planned a hike in dangerous terrain," Ellie pressed, "with your children, hoping that no one would ever find you?" Rachel scoffed. "The trip was supposed to fix things. I thought, if we were out there, just us, maybe we could reconnect. But he kept denying everything, kept protecting her. And then, on that cliff—" "You pushed him," Ellie whispered, "right in front of your daughters?" "They weren't supposed to follow us," Rachel cried. "I told them to stay inside the cabin. I never wanted them to see it." One of the officers stepped in, attaching handcuffs to Rachel's wrists and securing them to the bed frame. Her expression contorted into a glare. "This isn't over," she growled. Ellie met her eyes with cold determination. "It was over the moment you chose murder." Rachel's threats followed Ellie into the hallway, but she didn't look back. She made her way to the recovery unit, where Wren had begun to stir. Her granddaughter's leg was now in a heavy cast, elevated on a foam wedge. Her tiny hand moved weakly, reaching out. "Grandma, Ellie," she murmured. Ellie rushed to her side, taking her hand gently. "I'm here, sweetheart. Everything went great. You're safe now." "Where's Ivy?" Wren asked, blinking slowly. "She's here, just in another room. You'll see her soon," Ellie promised, smoothing back Wren's hair as the little girl's eyelids fluttered closed again. That evening, with Wren finally resting, Ellie was escorted to a separate pediatric room. A child advocate sat quietly in the corner, a comforting presence for Ivy, who was curled up under a hospital blanket, holding a plush toy in a vice grip. The moment Ivy saw Ellie, her eyes filled with confusion and tentative hope. "Grandma Ellie?" she whispered. Ellie crossed the room slowly, her heart aching. "Yes, sweetheart, I'm here now." "Where's Mom and Wren?" Ellie knelt by the bed. "Wren is sleeping. Her leg was hurt, but the doctors fixed it. She's going to be just fine." "And Mom?" "She's with people who are asking questions about what happened on the mountain," Ellie replied gently. "For now, you and Wren are going to stay with me, where it's safe." Ivy's small body tensed. "Daddy's not coming back, is he?" "No, honey," Ellie said, tears threatening again. "Daddy's not coming back, but he loved you and Wren more than anything. That love never goes away." Tears rolled down Ivy's cheeks as she crawled into Ellie's arms. "I miss him." "I do too," Ellie said, rocking her gently. "And I'll be here with you every step of the way, I promise." They stayed like that, wrapped in silence, until Ivy's sobs softened and her breathing slowed. Ellie didn't move. Her body ached with exhaustion, but her resolve never wavered. Later that night, after both girls were settled, Ellie sat in the hospital chapel, alone. The stillness brought no peace, only reflection. Her son was gone, murdered by the woman he had once loved. His life insurance had nearly become the prize for a scheme that could have taken 2 more lives. But Rachel would answer for every piece of it. Cal, too, would face judgment, yet Ellie knew the real battle was just beginning, helping Ivy and Wren heal from what they'd seen, what they'd survived, would be the hardest trail she'd ever walked. A nurse eventually came to fetch her. Wren had asked for her. She returned to her granddaughter's side and remained there through the night, humming softly when the child stirred. Outside the window, Moonlight painted the world in silver, casting long shadows across the snowy ground. Ellie pressed her hand gently against the glass, whispering a silent vow to her son. "I'll raise them right, Daniel, with love, with strength. They'll know the truth. And they'll know you." Because Ellie Whitaker had spent a lifetime navigating unforgiving wilderness. And now she would do the same through grief, custody hearings, and the slow, careful work of rebuilding a broken family. And she would not fail. Not this time. She paused briefly at the entrance, letting herself feel the warmth and hum of life inside. For just a moment she allowed the possibility to flicker in her mind, that maybe, tomorrow, she'd be reunited with her family. Maybe this nightmare could finally end. It struck her as painfully surreal. Just another evening in the mountains for most of the people gathered here, the comforting rhythm of lodge life carrying on undisturbed, while her own world remained fractured beyond recognition. As Ellie stepped through the doors of the lodge's main hall, a wave of warmth embraced her, mingling with the savory aroma of roasted meat and simmering broth. She inhaled deeply, the heat thawing her frozen fingertips as conversations momentarily dipped in volume at her arrival. Heads turned, murmurs flickered through the group. Conversations faltered, then resumed with the brittle quality of forced normalcy. It wasn't open cruelty, just the awkwardness that trailed tragedy like a shadow. She had become a quiet legend among these walls, but not for her decades of service or survival retreats. Now people whispered her name with the reverence reserved for those carrying unspeakable grief. Ellie moved toward the drink station, filled a cup with steaming water, and pulled a familiar item from her coat pocket. A travel-size cup of instant noodles. She poured the hot water carefully, watching it rise and soak the dry block of pasta, and then carried the cup to a chair near the edge of the gathering. Not quite within the circle, but not entirely isolated either. It was a position that suited her current state, adjacent to warmth and humanity, but not a part of it. As she stirred the contents of her makeshift dinner, her ears picked up a nearby conversation. Two men, both well into their 60s, speaking in low tones that still carried in the hush of the room. They were seated a few chairs away, unaware that their voices reached her during the brief lulls between louder bursts of laughter and clinking glasses. "That's Eleanor Whitaker, isn't it?" one of them asked with a sideways glance. "Yeah," the other replied with a nod. "The millionaire woman. Gave that huge donation to the Wilderness Education Foundation just last month." "Tragic, really," the first man muttered. "Donates all that money to teach kids how to survive out here, and then her own family goes missing. Karma can be cruel." The other gave a small shrug. "If it were my family, I wouldn't be sitting around waiting for dawn, storm be damned. I'd be out there searching." "Well," his companion added, not unkindly, "she's just one woman, doing all this alone. And she's not exactly young anymore." Ellie's grip tightened around the flimsy plastic fork. Her face, warmed by the rising steam of the noodles, had gone still, her jaw clenched to keep her reaction hidden. Around her, the hum of conversation resumed, but she couldn't hear anything else. Their words echoed inside her skull. "If it were my family, storm be damned, just a woman." They didn't understand. They hadn't seen the footage. They hadn't stood helplessly on the edge of hope and despair for weeks. But one thing cut through the din of judgment and speculation. Daniel wouldn't have waited. If she were the one missing in those frozen woods, he would have gone after her without hesitation. And now, so would she. She finished just enough of her noodles to quiet the growl in her stomach, then rose silently and slipped away from the hall. No one stopped her. No one seemed to notice. The moment she stepped into the crisp night air, she felt clarity settle over her like a second skin. The snowfall had intensified, casting a dreamy haze over the empty courtyard. The glow from the lodge windows grew softer with each step she took toward her cabin. Once inside, Ellie moved with swift, practiced precision. She no longer questioned what she had to do. Her mind had been made up the moment she saw Rachel and the girls alive. From her bag, she retrieved the gear she hadn't touched since retirement. Her most reliable hiking essentials, layer after layer of thermal clothing, a waterproof, wind-resistant outer shell, reinforced boots that had carried her through hundreds of miles of unforgiving terrain. She unpacked her old search and rescue backpack and began organizing. It was still packed the way she'd left it after her final mission years ago, with emergency rations, a compact but fully stocked first aid kit, thermal blankets, and lightweight survival tools. Her GPS device blinked to life as she powered it on, and she immediately confirmed that both the online and offline maps were available. Cal's coordinates were already marked. She added extra batteries, high-calorie energy bars, her sub-no-rated sleeping bag, and 2 chemical heat packs. As she zipped the pack shut, a small voice in her head warned that this was reckless, that she was 67, going alone into uncharted terrain under worsening weather conditions, that help was coming in the morning. But another voice, a voice honed by 3 decades of training, rescue, and survival, overruled the doubt. She knew the statistics, knew that every lost hour could mean the difference between life and death. And if there was anyone still capable of surviving these mountains in a storm, it was her. With the pack secured across her back, Ellie slipped out into the darkness. She avoided the main path, taking a longer route behind the row of cabins to stay out of sight. The snow crunched beneath her boots, fresh and undisturbed. She pulled her headlamp from her pocket, but didn't switch it on. Not yet. The moon was hidden behind thick clouds, but she could still navigate by the soft, glowing reflection off the snow-covered landscape. When she reached the edge of the trail network, she paused. According to Cal's GPS coordinates, her route would lead northwest, away from the maintained paths and into remote, hazardous wilderness. Even in daylight, this would be a formidable hike. In darkness and snowfall, it was dangerous, but that was the point. That's where her family had been seen. That's where she had to go. She switched on her headlamp and drew a slow, calming breath. Then she began the ascent. The sounds of the lodge faded behind her, replaced by the rhythmic crunch of snow underfoot and the whisper of wind through pine branches. The trail, never clear to begin with, soon disappeared altogether. Ellie used landmarks and GPS waypoints to stay on track. As the hours slipped past, the temperature dropped further, the wind sharpening into cold razors that bit at her face. Snow whipped across her vision and visibility shrank to only a few feet. 2 hours into the hike, fatigue began to seep into her muscles. Her lips were numb, her fingers, even inside thick gloves, stiffened. She knew her limits, and she was nearing them. If the storm worsened, she would need to find shelter quickly. That's when she saw it. At first, it was only a vague suggestion, a glow in the distance, filtered through the blur of falling snow. She stopped, squinting. Was it a hallucination? A reflection? A flicker from her headlamp? No. It was steady, real. She moved forward, slowly at first, then with urgency. The faint light grew brighter, more defined. A cabin, an actual structure. Materialized out of the snow-swept gloom, nestled deep within a grove of wind-sheltered pines. Smoke drifted lazily from a chimney. There was a light in the window. Her heart pounded. Shelter, human presence, possibly even answers. She approached the building with measured caution. Her headlamp flicked across a sturdy log exterior, its walls dusted with fresh snow. The place looked well-maintained, not abandoned. Someone was here. She stepped closer, trembling, not just from the cold now, but from anticipation. If anyone inside had seen her family, or if her family was inside, this could be the moment everything changed. She raised a hand to knock, her breath catching in her throat. She couldn't tell if her breath had frozen from the cold or if it was simply caught in her throat. Ellie hesitated for only a second more, then knocked firmly on the wooden cabin door. No answer. She knocked again, louder this time, her knuckles hitting the grain with a determined rhythm. "Hello?" she called out, her voice strained but clear. "Is anyone there? Please, I need help." The silence that followed stretched long and thin, like a wire pulled to the point of snapping. She was just about to raise her hand for a third knock when the latch shifted with a metallic click and the door creaked open. Warm light spilled from within, casting a golden halo across the snow-covered ground. And standing there in the threshold, framed by firelight and shadow, was a face Ellie had only seen in photographs and fading hopes for the past 3 harrowing weeks. Rachel. She stood frozen in the doorway, her lips slightly parted, eyes wide with disbelief. For a heartbeat, neither woman moved. Then Rachel exhaled sharply and surged forward, grabbing Ellie's arm and pulling her inside with urgent strength. "Ellie? Oh my God, Ellie! How are you here? What are you doing here?" she stammered, her voice trembling as she helped her mother-in-law shed her snow-caked outerwear. Before Ellie could respond, two small voices echoed from deeper inside the cabin, laced with curiosity and sleep. "Mom? Who is it?" Peeking out from behind the edge of a wooden armchair were two familiar, precious faces, Ivy and Wren. Their eyes went wide as they recognized the figure now standing just inside the door. "Grandma Ellie!" they cried out together, their voices bright with astonished joy. They rushed forward, but then paused a few steps away, suddenly struck by a mix of shyness and uncertainty. Ellie dropped to her knees, overcome by a powerful wave of emotion and the sheer physical toll of her journey. Tears welled in her eyes and blurred the edges of the room. Her body ached, her hands and feet burned as the warmth of the cabin began thawing her frozen extremities, sending electric tingling coursing through her limbs. But all of it was eclipsed by the sight of her granddaughters, alive and safe. Rachel moved quickly to the modest kitchenette and returned moments later with a steaming mug, thrusting it into Ellie's chilled hands. "Here, drink this. You're half frozen," she said gently. Ellie sipped from the mug and recognized the reconstituted flavor of powdered milk. Warm, simple, nourishing. Rachel turned to the twins and gestured softly. "It's late, girls," she said with a mother's steady calm. "Back to bed now. Grandma Ellie needs to rest and warm up. You can talk to her in the morning." The twins hesitated, their eyes still fixed on Ellie, but obeyed. They shuffled back to a small corner bed, two sleeping bags zipped together and piled with thick blankets. Rachel handed each of them a small cup of warm milk, which they drank eagerly. She tucked them in with practiced tenderness, whispering something that made them giggle through their yawns. "Good night, Grandma Ellie," Ivy said softly, her eyes already drifting shut. "Night, Grandma," Wren mumbled a moment later, halfway into a dream. Their breathing slowed into a rhythmic calm, and soon the only sounds were the crackling of the wood stove and the muffled whistle of the wind outside. Ellie sat motionless for a few moments, her mind slowly catching up with the miracle unfolding around her. Relief surged through her in waves, threatening to overwhelm. But then, as the initial wonder began to settle, the questions came. One in particular rose above the rest, pressing forward until it could no longer be ignored. "Rachel," she began quietly, careful to keep her voice from reaching the girls. "Where's Daniel?" The color drained from Rachel's face. She turned away and moved to the small wooden table in the center of the cabin, lowering herself slowly into a chair. Ellie followed, settling across from her, the warmth of the mug still radiating through her palms. The cabin, she now observed, was modest but solid. One large room with a compact kitchen, the sleeping area, and a faded leather sofa. The wood stove doubled as a cooking surface. Shelves lining the back wall were stocked with supplies, canned food, jugs of water, basic tools and gear. Whoever had built this place had intended it to be a survival shelter. "Rachel," Ellie said again, her voice firmer now. "What happened? Where is my son?" Rachel's eyes shimmered. She stared down at her own mug, turning it between her hands as if hoping the warmth might give her strength. When she spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "We had an accident," she said. "That day we went hiking. We didn't check the forecast properly. The snowstorm hit faster than we expected. We couldn't turn back." Ellie's brow furrowed. "But why were you up here at all? This area is marked on all park maps as dangerous. Daniel knew that better than anyone." Rachel bit her lip, eyes glistening. "He just wanted to try something different. We'd been hiking the same trails for years. The girls were getting restless, bored. He thought we'd just explore a little, stay low on the slope, stay safe. We never meant to come this far, but then the storm hit. So fast. And when we tried to go back, it was already worse behind us than ahead." She paused to wipe at her eyes, her hands shaking slightly. "We found this cabin completely by accident. If we hadn't, we might not have survived that first night." Ellie nodded slowly, understanding the truth in her words. A shelter like this could mean the difference between life and death in a blizzard. "But Daniel?" she asked again, the question a blade she could no longer keep sheathed. Rachel's face crumpled. Her shoulders hunched forward, as though the weight of memory itself had become unbearable. It took her several long moments to speak again. The next morning, when the snow had calmed a bit, he said he'd go for help, thought maybe if he could reach higher ground, find a ranger, or get a signal. Her voice faltered. "I waited, and waited. Hours passed. Then another storm rolled in, worse than the first." She covered her mouth, trying to compose herself. "I couldn't go after him, not with the girls. I had to keep them safe. I stayed. I waited." Ellie's voice was hoarse. "Did you ever find him? Any trace?" Rachel shook her head. "No. After the second storm, I tried to search nearby, but I couldn't leave the twins for more than a few minutes. Every time I thought I saw something, the weather would shift again. We've been stuck here, waiting, trying to survive." Ellie felt her heart constrict. The pain, the helplessness, it all pressed down like a crushing weight. She struggled to speak, her mouth dry. "Daniel is—" "I don't know," Rachel admitted, finally meeting Ellie's eyes. "I've had to start accepting that he might not be—" Her voice cracked, and she buried her face in her hands. Her body shook with silent sobs, the grief pouring out in jagged breaths. After a long moment, Ellie asked the question that had lingered at the back of her mind since the moment she arrived. "Do the girls know?" Rachel exhaled slowly and lowered her hands, her expression composed but strained. "Very smart," Rachel said, her voice heavy with sorrow. "They're smart, always asking questions. By the second week, they knew something was very wrong. I couldn't keep pretending. I had to tell them that Daddy might not be coming back." Ellie's gaze shifted to the far corner of the room, where the twins lay huddled together under thick blankets, their identical faces peaceful in sleep. They looked so small, so heartbreakingly innocent. The thought of them trying to process such devastating news, at their age, broke something deep inside Ellie. Her hand clenched slightly around the warm mug. "But why did you stay here?" she asked gently, turning back to Rachel. "It's been 3 weeks. Surely there were breaks in the weather, windows of time where you could have tried to make it back down the mountain." Rachel's eyes darkened. Her voice was quiet, haunted. "I was afraid. Maybe if it had just been me, maybe I would have taken the risk. But with the twins, after losing Daniel, I couldn't bear the thought of something happening to them too. So we stayed. We used the supplies we found here. Waited." Ellie rose from her chair, suddenly needing to move. She crossed to the shelves and began to examine the supplies with greater care. Rows of canned goods lined the makeshift pantry: beans, soup, and vegetables, dried meat, powdered milk. Nothing unusual on the surface, but something tugged at her attention. One of the milk boxes looked fresh. Too fresh. "These supplies?" she said aloud, lifting a box and turning it over. "They don't seem like they've been sitting here for years." Rachel stood and walked over to join her. "No, I don't think they have. I think someone uses this cabin regularly. A hunter, maybe. Whoever they are, they keep it stocked. There's enough here to last us for a while longer." Ellie set the milk down, her brow furrowed. Something wasn't sitting right. She turned to dispose of her now empty mug and moved toward the trash bin near the door. As she stepped closer, a faint glint caught her eye. Something metallic, reflecting just beneath a loose floorboard. Crouching down, Ellie ran her fingers across the seam. She found the edge and pried gently. The board lifted with ease. "There's something under here," she murmured, more to herself than anyone. Rachel stepped closer, her posture tense. "What is it?" Ellie reached into the shallow space and pulled out a small object. A ring. Her breath caught. A wedding band, simple but elegant, with a distinctive diamond inlay embedded in its center. "This is Daniel's ring," she whispered. Her heart thudded in her chest. "I gave it to him myself on his wedding day." The ring was clean. Too clean. It bore none of the scuffs, dust, or grime she would have expected after being hidden beneath the floor for weeks. Rachel's expression was unreadable. She reached for the ring slowly. "It must have slipped off that first night," she said quickly. We were all so cold. Our hands were numb. He probably didn't even notice it fall through the crack. Ellie handed it over, watching closely as Rachel slid it onto her thumb. Her explanation came too fast, too neat. Something about the entire exchange set Ellie's nerves on edge, though she couldn't yet articulate why. She stood again and swept her gaze around the cabin. Suddenly, she noticed more details she hadn't caught earlier. A hefty stack of chopped firewood near the door. Far more than anyone would expect in an abandoned shelter. A cabinet, slightly ajar, revealing not just old supplies but recently packaged goods. "Rachel," Ellie said slowly, "if this cabin was abandoned, why is there so much firewood? And why are there supplies here that look brand new?" For the briefest moment, something flickered across Rachel's face. Panic, guilt, fear. It vanished quickly, replaced by a calm mask. "I told you," Rachel said evenly. "I think someone uses this place. Probably a hunter. Maybe they stopped by while we were sleeping. We've been hiding whenever we hear footsteps after everything that's happened." "I didn't know who to trust." Ellie nodded slowly, but the explanation settled uneasily in her stomach. She turned back toward the kitchen, her mind spinning with questions. And then, a flash of motion in her peripheral vision. Before she could react, pain exploded across the back of her skull. The last thing she saw was Rachel's face. Hard, emotionless, as she raised the butt of a hunting shotgun high above her head. Then, darkness consumed everything. Consciousness returned to Ellie in fragments. Pain, sharp and rhythmic, pounded behind her eyes. Her head throbbed with every breath. Next came the cold. Her limbs felt stiff and numb, a stark contrast to the heated panic rising in her chest. Then the smell hit her. Acrid, sharp, chemical. Her eyes snapped open. She blinked against the dizziness, trying to focus. The cabin was dark now. The once roaring fire had died down to smoldering embers, casting dim shadows across the walls. Through the frost-rimmed windows, Ellie could see stars. The storm had passed. She tried to move and realized she couldn't. Looking down, her heart seized. She was tied to a wooden chair, her wrists and ankles bound tightly with thick rope. The bindings cut into her skin. Panic surged like a wave. The chemical odor grew stronger. Gas was leaking into the room. She coughed, the fumes burning her throat. The small bed where the twins had slept was empty. The blankets were tossed aside. The cabin was silent. They were gone. Rachel had left her, tied up, alone, in a gas-filled cabin with a slowly burning fire that would, inevitably, ignite the fumes. Ellie's mind reeled. She meant for me to die here. That single word burned hotter than the throbbing in her skull. Why would Rachel do this? But she didn't have time to unravel the motives. Survival came first. She shifted, testing the ropes. They were tight but not expertly tied. If she could create just a bit of slack. The chair beneath her was old but solid, its joints creaking as she rocked back and forth. She began to move, tiny increments, forcing her muscles to work despite the pain. Her vision swam, her head pounded, the gas fumes made every breath harder. But she didn't stop. She couldn't. Because somewhere out there, the twins were with a woman who had just tried to murder her. And time was running out. Ellie gathered all her strength and threw her weight to the side, toppling the chair onto the wooden floor with a jarring crash. The impact sent a fresh wave of pain surging through her skull, the force reverberating through her already throbbing head. Stars burst behind her eyelids, but something else did too. A faint crack along one of the chair's aging legs. Encouraged, she repeated the motion, slamming her shoulder and the chair's side into the floor again, then again. By the fourth attempt, a sharp splintering sound broke through the ringing in her ears. The back leg snapped at the joint, creating just enough instability in the frame for Ellie to shift her weight differently. Through clenched teeth, she twisted her body, inching her bound hands toward her side pocket. Her fingers, sluggish from cold and restricted blood flow, trembled as they fumbled through the fabric. And then she found it. The small folding knife. She always carried it. It was part of her standard wilderness gear, never left behind. Her heart pounded as she gripped the handle. Flipping it open one-handed while her wrists were bound was excruciating, requiring every ounce of her dexterity and focus. The knife resisted, but after a tense moment, the blade clicked into place. Without hesitation, she began sawing at the ropes around her wrists, careful to avoid her skin. The acrid stench of gas now clung to everything. Her vision swam, her lungs screamed for clean air, and her head felt light, but she kept going. Somewhere behind her, near the hearth, a small ember shifted, then caught. A soft whoosh followed, low and sinister, as a fresh flame bloomed. It licked across the floor toward the kitchen, the gas in the air acting like a fuse. Ellie felt one wrist come free just as the fire erupted, racing greedily across the old wooden boards. She freed the other hand quickly, then bent to untie her ankles. Her limbs were numb, her joints stiff, but adrenaline overrode the pain. She stood up, unsteady on her feet, swaying slightly as a blast of heat from the rapidly growing fire pressed against her back. Smoke was curling into the air. The gas and the flames were nearing a deadly crescendo. She stumbled to the cabin door, tried the knob. Locked. Whether from the outside or with a key, she couldn't tell. No time to figure it out. Spinning, she grabbed a thick log from the firewood stack beside the door, then charged the nearest window. It was single-paned, old glass, fragile beneath enough force. With a grunt, she slammed the log into it. The pane cracked, but didn't break. A second swing shattered it, sending shards of glass scattering into the snow outside. She used the log to knock away the jagged edges, ignoring the sharp stings as they sliced her hands. Behind her, the fire surged higher. The heat swelled suddenly as the flames found a dense pocket of gas. A deep whoosh followed, accompanied by a burst of pressure that knocked her forward. Her hair was singed at the ends, her jacket smoked. But she didn't stop. Ellie clambered through the window frame, the broken glass biting into her thigh. She hit the snow hard, rolling into the freezing powder as the heat roared behind her. The frigid night was a violent shock after the inferno. Her skin stung with cold, but it was better than being turned to ash. Rolling away from the cabin, Ellie watched in horror as the entire structure went up in flames. It burned with a greedy fury, the fire curling into the sky like a living thing. The same glow that had seemed so welcoming just hours earlier was now the light of betrayal and attempted murder. Everything she had brought with her, her pack, her GPS, her food, her only means of communication, was gone, consumed in the fire. She was alone in the wilderness, injured, disoriented, vulnerable. But she was alive. And somewhere out there, Rachel was on the run with Ivy, the other twin, Daniel's daughter. Daniel, who was almost certainly dead. Ellie couldn't suppress the truth anymore. If Daniel's death had been an accident, Rachel wouldn't have tried to kill her. Rachel's facade had cracked the moment Ellie asked too many questions, the moment she got too close to the truth. She forced herself to her feet, wincing as pain shot through her leg where the glass had sliced her. The gash was deep, but not crippling. She pressed a hand to it to staunch the bleeding. Above her, the stars glimmered in a brilliant display. The storm had passed. The sky was clear. She located the North Star quickly. Instinct, born of years in the back country, and reminded herself that the lodge lay west of the cabin's location. But before she could begin the long trek toward safety, a sound reached her ears. A small voice. Frightened, calling out from somewhere deeper in the forest. She froze, her senses sharpening. Then the voice came again, clearer this time. One of the twins. Without thought, Ellie turned and began to move toward the sound, each step a struggle through the deep, uneven snow. The cold gnawed at her wounds, but she ignored it. She pushed through a dense cluster of pines, their branches heavy with frost, and emerged into a clearing. There, against a rocky outcropping, was a small figure in a purple jacket. The color was unmistakable. It was Wren. She was huddled on the ground, one leg extended awkwardly. "Wren?" Ellie called softly, approaching slowly so she wouldn't startle her. The girl looked up, her face streaked with tears, her eyes red and swollen. "Grandma Ellie," she whimpered. "It hurts, My leg, it really hurts." Ellie dropped to her knees beside her granddaughter, her breath catching as she examined the leg. Even in the dim starlight she could see the swelling, twice the normal size, around the ankle. It was either a severe sprain or a break. "What happened, sweetheart?" she asked gently, pulling her scarf from her neck. "Where's your mom? Where's Ivy?" Wren sniffled, wincing in pain. "I fell down the hill. Mom tried to help me, but then she said we had to keep going. She said—" her voice broke. "She said something about sacrifice. Then she took Ivy and left me here." Ellie froze. Rage surged inside her, hotter than the fire she'd just escaped. Rachel had abandoned her own child in a snow-covered wilderness with a likely broken leg. To die. Beneath the fury, Ellie felt something else. An iron resolve hardened within her. "I'm here now," she said softly, keeping her voice calm despite the firestorm in her chest. "I'm going to get you somewhere safe." With practiced hands, she used her scarf and 2 firm branches to splint the ankle. Her movements were steady and sure, though her own hands trembled from blood loss and shock. Then, with a quiet grunt, she lifted Wren into her arms. The child was light, too light, from weeks of hardship. Ellie cradled her close, sharing what warmth she could. "It's going to be okay," she whispered, kissing the top of Wren's head. "Hold on tight. We've got a long walk ahead of us." Wren nodded weakly, wrapping her thin arms around Ellie's neck. And with that the old ranger turned toward the woods, carrying the child through the snow toward the faintest hope of safety. Her body trembled with cold and trauma, her legs aching from exhaustion, yet Ellie tapped into a hidden reservoir of strength as she began the long descent down the mountain. Every step was deliberate, every breath a struggle. But in her arms she carried Wren, precious, injured, and alive. That child's safety was all that mattered now. She had no equipment, no map, no GPS. The only thing guiding her was decades of experience in these unforgiving mountains and an iron resolve forged in years of search and rescue missions. She was a mother, a grandmother, and now she was the only shield standing between Wren and the darkness that had nearly consumed them. Somewhere ahead, Rachel was still out there, fleeing with Ivy. Ellie didn't know where she was going or what she planned to do next, but once Wren was safe, she would make sure Rachel never got the chance to hurt anyone else again. Not Ivy, not anyone. The journey down the slope was agonizing. Every joint in Ellie's body screamed in protest. Her legs burned with each step, and her arms ached from carrying the extra weight. But she refused to stop. Wren had drifted into a restless sleep, her breath shallow, her face pale. Occasionally, a whimper would escape her lips as pain broke through her exhaustion, but Ellie whispered softly to her, each word a fragile promise that everything would be okay. The world around them was eerily quiet. The wind had calmed, and the snow had ceased, leaving behind a silver-lit wilderness of stillness and cold. Ellie navigated by starlight and memory, avoiding steep ridges and seeking the most forgiving terrain. She recognized familiar rock formations, tree clusters, and faint landmarks etched into her mind through a lifetime spent in this park. She had no watch, but the sky told her the time. Slowly, the black canvas overhead began to fade into softer shades of blue. Dawn was approaching. When she crested a small ridge and saw a faint trail marker ahead, she knew they were close. "Wren," she said softly, pausing to shift the child's weight. "Sweetie, we're almost there." The girl stirred weakly, blinking at their surroundings. Her lips were pale and her face drawn, but a glimmer of recognition sparked in her eyes as she spotted the trail sign ahead. Is Mom there?" she asked, voice barely more than a whisper. The question hit Ellie like a knife. How could she tell a 7-year-old that her mother had abandoned her? That Rachel had tried to kill the woman now carrying her to safety? That she had taken Ivy and disappeared? "I don't know," Ellie said, keeping her voice soft but steady. "But there are people who can help us. That's what matters right now." The final stretch of their journey wound past a few scattered outbuildings and into the clearing that housed the central lodge. Morning activity had begun, hikers adjusting backpacks, staff members hauling gear, setting up for the day ahead. Ellie stepped forward, summoning the last of her strength, and cried out. "Help! We need help!" Her voice rang through the crisp air. Heads turned. For a heartbeat, the world stood still. Then chaos erupted. Several people rushed toward her, shouts of concern and urgency rising all around. Ellie's legs finally buckled, her body giving out after hours of non-stop exertion. She sank to her knees in the snow, still cradling Wren protectively. "Get medical assistance!" someone shouted. "Call the manager!" Hands reached for her, gentle, firm, reassuring. They lifted Ellie upright, and others carefully pried Wren from her embrace. Ellie resisted briefly until someone spoke gently. "We'll take care of her. You're safe now." They guided them into the lodge, the heat of the foyer wrapping around Ellie like a second skin. The smell of coffee, wood smoke, and wool filled the space. Voices swirled. Questions, concern, disbelief. "That's Eleanor Whitaker. She's got one of the missing twins." The lodge manager appeared, his face paling with shock as he recognized her. "Miss Whitaker, what happened? How did you—" Ellie raised a hand, her voice hoarse. "Call the police. Rachel tried to kill me. She left Wren in the snow to die." A hush fell over the crowd. Several people who had begun filming lowered their phones. Others simply stared, unable to reconcile the legendary ranger before them with the horror she was describing. "We need to get them warm," the manager said, recovering, "and the child needs medical care immediately." They were ushered toward the large stone fireplace. Blankets were wrapped around their shoulders, and a cup of hot broth was pressed into Ellie's trembling hands. A woman with first aid certification knelt beside Wren, gently examining the swollen ankle. Another brought a heater closer, working to restore circulation. "Miss Whitaker," the manager said quietly, kneeling beside her, "the gondola crew reported seeing a woman with a child this morning. They think it was Rachel." "And Ivy." "Which way were they headed?" Ellie asked, dread hardening in her chest. "Down the mountain. Fast. They didn't stop to speak." Ellie's heart sank. If Rachel had reached the gondola, she could be anywhere now. Moments later, the high-pitched wail of sirens cut through the quiet morning. Emergency responders arrived in a blur of flashing lights and urgency. Paramedics swarmed the lodge, carefully lifting Wren onto a stretcher. Her vitals were checked, and her ankle was stabilized. "I want to stay with my granddaughter," Ellie said firmly as they prepared to move her. "Of course," one paramedic assured her. "We'll transport you both. The helicopter's already on standby." Outside, the whir of blades filled the air. It was the fastest way to the regional hospital, and Ellie was loaded into the chopper alongside Wren, who had slipped back into unconsciousness from pain and fatigue. As the helicopter lifted off, a uniformed police officer approached, bracing himself against the wind. "Ms. Whitaker," he called out, raising his voice, "we need a formal statement from you as soon as possible. There are conflicting accounts." Ellie narrowed her eyes. "What do you mean?" "A woman identifying herself as Rachel Whitaker was brought in earlier," the officer said. "She was found near the park's main entrance with a child. A hunter helped her down the mountain." "What's she claiming?" "She says that after your son disappeared, you became unstable. She claims you tracked them to a shelter and tried to harm her and the children." Ellie stared at the officer, her mouth agape. "That's a lie. She knocked me unconscious and left me tied up in a cabin filled with gas. She set it on fire and left Wren to die in the snow. If I hadn't gotten out—" The officer nodded slowly, his expression unreadable. "We'll take official statements from both of you, and from the child when she's able." "Her name is Wren," Ellie said, gripping her granddaughter's hand tightly, "and right now she needs medical care more than a police report." "Understood," he replied. "We'll follow you to the hospital." Ellie leaned back as the helicopter tilted and began its descent toward the valley below, wind rushing past the open doors. She didn't know what the coming hours would bring. She didn't know what Rachel had already told. But the truth was finally in motion. And Ellie Whitaker wasn't done fighting. The officer stepped back as the helicopter crew secured the doors, giving a firm thumbs up before retreating from the aircraft. The rotors spun faster, the pitch rising, and with a rumble beneath them, the helicopter lifted into the pale morning sky. Ellie sat strapped in her seat, still clutching Rin's small, limp hand, her eyes locked on the snowy wilderness slipping away beneath them. The mountain that had tested every limit of her endurance faded behind them, but the battle wasn't over. In the span of a single night, she had found part of her family, lost her son all over again, survived an attempt on her life, and now she was being thrust into a storm of a different kind. Rachel, the woman who had once called her Mom, who had promised to protect Daniel's daughters, was now trying to twist everything. She was attempting to make Ellie the villain, to rewrite the truth into something monstrous. And worse still, she was holding Ivy alone. With God only knew what poison in her words, what lies she might already be whispering into the ears of the child who no longer had a father. The thought of it made Ellie's jaw clench. The paramedic seated across from her glanced up from the monitors, concern shadowing his face. "Ma'am," he said gently, "I need to check your injuries too. You've got lacerations that need cleaning and possible head trauma from blunt force. We'll be landing soon, but I can begin treatment now." Ellie nodded absently, her focus drifting as the medic examined the back of her skull. She felt the sting of antiseptic, the pressure of gauze, but none of it registered fully. Her mind was already at the hospital, picturing the waiting rooms, the questions, the statements that would need to be made, and above all, the weight of what she would eventually have to explain to her granddaughters, what had happened and what it all meant. "Grandma Ellie." Wren's voice was small and trembling. Ellie turned quickly, leaning close and brushing her hand across the girl's forehead. "I'm here, sweetheart. I've got you. I'm scared." "I know, baby," Ellie whispered, her voice soft but unwavering. "But I'm right here. I'm not going anywhere." And she meant it. No matter how twisted Rachel's lies became, no matter how hard this fight would be, Ellie wasn't going to let these girls suffer another moment of fear or betrayal. The hospital was a blur of motion. Bright lights, wheeled gurneys, the scent of antiseptic in the air. Nurses moved briskly between stations while doctors consulted clipboards and digital tablets. Family members hovered in waiting areas, their faces carved with anxiety. Ellie sat just outside the radiology department, a bandage wrapped around her head, smaller dressings covering the cuts on her hands. The physicians had confirmed a mild concussion, no fracture, but insisted she remain for observation. She had refused. They wanted her in a different wing, separate from Wren. Ellie wouldn't have it. The child had already been abandoned once. A uniformed officer stood nearby, his stance neutral but vigilant. Was he assigned to protect her or monitor her? She wasn't sure. After landing, they'd been separated briefly for medical triage, but as more officers arrived, the atmosphere had shifted. Tenser, guarded. Rachel was already weaving her false narrative somewhere in this very building. The elevator chimed and Ellie looked up. Cal Jennings stepped out. His presence was both unexpected and oddly comforting. He moved with purpose, nodding to the officer before approaching her. "Miss Whitaker," he greeted her, his voice low. "I heard what happened on the mountain. I'm glad you made it down." Ellie's eyes narrowed slightly, scanning his face. "Thank you, Cal. I didn't expect to see you here." "I need to speak with you, and the police," he said, his voice more serious now. "There's something I haven't told you, something important." Before she could respond, a doctor stepped into the hallway, holding a tablet. "Miss Whitaker," he said, "your granddaughter's X-rays show a clean break in her tibia. We'll need to operate, set the bone, and insert pins to ensure proper healing." Ellie rose immediately. "When?" "We're prepping the OR now. We'll need a signed consent form to proceed." "I want to see her first." The doctor nodded and led her into the exam area. Wren lay pale and small on the gurney, her leg elevated and an IV threaded into her arm. Her face lit up as Ellie entered. "The doctors said they're going to fix my leg," she said, brave despite the fear in her eyes. Ellie smiled, brushing her cheek. "That's right, sweetheart. They'll make you as good as new. You'll be asleep the whole time, and when you wake up, you'll be healed." Wren blinked. "Will Mom sign the papers?" Ellie hesitated, unsure of how to answer, without planting more confusion in the child's heart. "She doesn't have to," the doctor interjected gently. "Given the emergency and the uncertainty of guardianship, your authorization is sufficient for now, Miss Whitaker." Ellie sighed in relief. "Thank you. I'll sign whatever you need." After finishing the paperwork and promising Wren she'd be there when she woke, Ellie returned to the hallway, where Cal and the officer were waiting. Cal gestured toward a side room. "We should talk privately." The officer led them into a consultation space, where two more detectives were waiting. Once the door shut, Cal exhaled slowly, like a man preparing to unload a great weight. "I need to say something first," he began. "I'm sorry, or all of it. What I'm about to tell you won't be easy." Ellie squared her shoulders. "Just tell us the truth." Cal nodded grimly. 3 weeks ago, I returned to my cabin after a hunt and found them already there. Rachel, Daniel, and the twins. They'd gotten caught in the storm and stumbled onto the place by accident. Ellie's heart began to race. "My cabin," he clarified. "I built it myself years ago. It's off-grid, not on any official maps. I use it every winter." "You let them stay," Ellie said slowly. "Yes, Daniel told me they'd gotten turned around, that the weather had come in fast. He asked if they could stay the night and get their bearings in the morning." Cal looked down. "They seemed shaken, but okay. The girls were exhausted. I offered them food and firewood." "What happened the next day?" one of the detectives asked. Cal hesitated, then said, "Rachel came to me while Daniel was outside. She said they'd been having problems, that he was unstable. She asked for help getting down the mountain. I told her I wouldn't interfere in a family matter unless someone was in danger." He swallowed hard. "Later that night, I heard yelling. When I came back inside, Daniel was gone. They said they'd leave once the weather cleared, once the girls felt better," Cal continued, his voice faltering. He stared at the ground, visibly struggling with what came next. "I left them there for privacy," he said, finally lifting his gaze. "I told myself I'd head back to the lodge, but the storm worsened. Hail came in fast. I was halfway down the slope when I heard it. Screaming. Kids. Panic." The room fell into complete silence, the air thick with anticipation and disbelief. Every pair of eyes in the room locked on to Cal as he took a shaky breath and continued. "I followed the sounds through the trees, and I saw her, Rachel. She was standing on the cliff edge with Daniel. They were arguing. He turned to walk away, and she shoved him." A horrified gasp escaped Ellie's lips, her hand flying to her mouth. Tears welled in her eyes as Cal's words shattered the final remnants of her hope. He went over the edge, just disappeared. Cal's voice broke. "The girls, Wren and Ivy, were nearby. I saw them hiding behind some trees. Rachel kept telling them not to move, to stay put." Ellie felt like the floor had vanished beneath her. It was the confirmation she'd feared but hadn't been ready to hear. Her son hadn't been lost in a tragic storm. He had been murdered by the woman he trusted most. "Why didn't you report this immediately?" one of the officers asked, his voice sharp with disbelief. Cal's shoulders slumped. "Rachel saw me watching. I wanted to confront her, but with the storm, the terrain, the kids right there, I was scared and ashamed." He paused, then continued, his voice heavy with guilt. "Back at the cabin, she made me an offer, said if I let her and the girls stay hidden in the cabin until they were eventually found, naturally by search parties, she'd pay me. Enough to disappear and retire. $2 million. Ellie's voice was barely a whisper. "Daniel's life insurance." Cal nodded slowly. "She told me he'd just consulted a lawyer about changing his will. He was planning to create trust funds for the girls, set things up in case of a divorce. But the paperwork wasn't finalized. If he died while they were still legally married, and if no charges were brought against her, the entire policy would go to Rachel." One of the detectives leaned forward. "What changed? Why are you coming forward now?" Cal's face hardened. "I saw the missing posters everywhere, watching how the girls cried for their father. It wore me down. But what really changed things was last night. I overheard Rachel talking on the phone with her lawyer. She planned to implicate me, to say I helped push Daniel. She said she'd tell the police I was obsessed with her, that I manipulated the whole thing." He looked directly at Ellie. "That's when I knew. I couldn't stay quiet any longer. Ellie sat motionless, her breath shallow, fury and sorrow churning violently inside her. Cal stepped closer, his tone earnest. "Miss Whitaker, I'm so sorry. I should have led you straight to them when you showed me that poster. I was scared. And selfish. But when I saw Rachel this morning, alone with only one of the girls, I knew something was wrong. That's when I called the police." Ellie's jaw tightened. A complex storm of emotion brewed within her. Gratitude for the role he'd played in saving Wren, and revulsion for the complicity that had cost her son his life. "She killed Daniel," Ellie said, her voice trembling. "And you helped her cover it up." Cal nodded slowly, unable to meet her gaze. "I know, and I'll accept whatever consequences come my way. I just couldn't live with myself anymore." One of the officers stood. "Mr. Jennings, you're under arrest as an accessory after the fact to homicide. You have the right to remain silent." As the detective read him his rights, Ellie sat in stunned silence, trying to process the full weight of what she had just heard. Her son hadn't died trying to save his family in a storm. He'd been murdered in cold blood. His daughters had witnessed it, and for weeks his killer had lived comfortably in a cabin, plotting her future. Cal allowed himself to be handcuffed without resistance. Before they led him out, he turned to Ellie one last time. "For what it's worth, I truly am sorry. Without me, you might never have found your granddaughter. I hope someday you can forgive me." Ellie raised her hand slightly, her expression unreadable. For a moment it seemed like she might lash out, but her arm dropped back to her side. "You're right about one thing," she said, her voice quiet. "Without you, I might never have found Wren and Ivy, and for that I thank you. But forgiveness?" She shook her head slowly. "That's not something I have to give. Not today." The remaining officer approached her gently. "We're moving to arrest Rachel Whitaker now. With Cal's testimony and what we expect to learn from the children, we have enough to charge her with first-degree murder and attempted murder." Ellie's eyes widened. "Where's Ivy? Is she safe?" "She's in a secured room with a child advocate. Rachel's been isolated since we became aware of the conflicting statements." Before Ellie could reply, a soft knock came at the door. A nurse peeked in. "Miss Whitaker, your granddaughter is out of surgery. Everything went smoothly. She's in recovery now. You can see her soon." Ellie nodded, gratitude washing over her. At least something had gone right. The officer stood. "We're heading to Rachel's room now to formally arrest her. Would you like to be present?" Ellie considered the question for only a moment. "Yes. I need to look her in the eye." They walked together down the corridor, past the buzz of hospital staff and families, toward a guarded wing. Outside one of the rooms, a small cluster of officers stood in quiet discussion. They greeted Ellie with solemn nods. "We're ready," the lead detective said. "You can observe, Miss Whitaker, but let us handle the arrest formally." Ellie nodded, jaw set. They entered the hospital room together. Rachel lay in bed, an IV in her arm, monitors beeping softly around her. Her eyes narrowed the moment she saw Ellie. "Rachel Whitaker," the detective began, his voice stern and authoritative.